Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. It feels like morning to me. It's about 4:45 in the morning. So look, in the next short while, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of, I suppose, what's been happening in Ireland in relation to agriculture and water quality. Um, so moving in, so talk outline, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about water quality in Ireland to start with, how we've approached water quality over the last 30 years or so, the legislation and some recent research on that. And I hope it gives you some ideas, because the challenges that you as an industry are, I suppose, discussing at the moment here are the exact same challenges that we're still discussing in Ireland. We don't have all the answers, but hopefully we have maybe some advice that you don't go down certain roads. So just in terms of water qualities, there is in Ireland. So we measure water quality in Ireland based on the biology of the water. So our EPA use macroinvertebrates, which are small little insects in the water, and they can tell if the water is good quality, moderate, poor, etc. And what you see, I suppose, over the last number of years, there's been a decline in what's deemed to be good water quality, which isn't so good. This line, you can't really see it, but the seriously polluted waters have decreased, and we've got an increase in the area of moderately polluted, and that is eutrophication. So excess algal growth, etc., leading to changes in the water quality. We have seen some positive trends recently, so I'll go into the legislation. Well, we have a piece of legislation called the Water Framework Directive. It sort of couples biological, chemical and physical quality of waters. And what we can see, generally our waters are pretty good. Nearly 60% of the rivers are what are deemed to be good. Estuaries are doing really well as well, but also more importantly, the trends over time in terms of water quality are improving. So those are all good signs. Typically, we don't have a nitrate problem in Ireland. We do in some areas, and that's associated with estuaries and excess algal growth in estuaries and coastal waters. Our main problem is phosphorus. So over quite a number of years, since the 1970s, we've had a range of different bits of legislation that local authorities and regulators have brought in, water pollution acts and all these sorts of things, where they bring farmers to court and prosecute them for fish kills and things like that. In 1991, the EU introduced the Nitrates Directive, which was, I suppose, a really interesting piece of legislation which aimed to protect drinking water quality from excess nitrate. And unfortunately for us, they wrote in almost in an annex, they mentioned eutrophication. And that's the bit that really stung us quite badly. But the main focus was on drinking water quality. And it was all around agriculture and reducing nitrogen loss from agriculture. In the early 90s then in Ireland, we introduced what we called the Rural Environmental Protection Scheme. This was a voluntary scheme funded partially by our national government and partially by the EU. It was related to, I suppose, increasing the environmental aspects of the common agricultural policy in Europe. In 1996 then, we introduced what we called the Code of Good Agricultural Practice. This was a specific code for the Nitrates Directive, so it took 5 years to get this code published. Again, it was voluntary. The government designated the whole of Ireland as being vulnerable to nitrate leaching, in inverted commas. But this also meant that there was a level playing field for all farmers. Nobody was disadvantaged one over another just because of a certain soil that you were on or a certain river that you were close to. Everybody was the same, and it also aided implementation of the measures that would come under that, in that everybody had to do them. So they're easy to regulate. You know, if you need to be doing it, everybody needs to do it. In the early 2000s or the late 90s, it became quite clear to the EU that they still had a problem with water quality, and they introduced the Water Framework Directive, and this was an all-encompassing piece of legislation, and it said all waters have to be good status, full stop. And that good status is chemical, biological, and what they call hydromorphological, or the physical sides, and also the quantity of water. So if you're in a country that irrigates, you can't be irrigating more than your groundwater supplies are replenished by rainfall. This then took another 5 years for us to actually produce our national regulations, which were produced in 2006. So I'm going to go through a few of those for you now and pick out some salient points that might be of interest to you. The Rural Environmental Protection Scheme, again, this was a general scheme around the environment. It had biodiversity aspects to it, it had cultural protection, but it also had water quality. In Ireland, we have about 130,000 farmers out of a population of 4 million, so it's quite a lot of people claim to be a farmer in Ireland. 55,000 of them partook in this early stage of the Environmental Protection Scheme, which is a large proportion, but they were mostly the less intensive farmers. There was a range of measures, as I mentioned, but some of the water quality ones were, they had to have a nutrient management plan, they had to have a grassland management plan, they had to protect watercourses and wells with designated distances that they could apply manures or fertiliser to. There was options around low fertilisers or the use of legumes in their crops, cover crops, buffers and things like that. They didn't have to do all of them, they could select which measures they wanted to do. But that was in 94. That was before the Nitrates Directive regulations actually kicked in, and some of these became mandatory under those regulations. Examples, we heard about fencing of watercourses earlier, but when you fence a watercourse, so unfenced on the left, fenced on the right, you dramatically improve the quality of the stream in terms of protecting it and preventing excess nutrients entering it. In terms of we then introduced an action programme in the mid 2000s, 2006. Very controversial. It annoyed an awful lot of farmers. They protested quite heavily to government and put a lot of pressure on our politicians. So far, we've had 4 different action plans, and gradually over the years, the mitigation measures have become more stringent within those. I'm going to highlight a couple of them now. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but there was a limit placed on the number of stock you could have on the farm. So the stocking rate in the Nitrates Directive was set at 170 kilograms per hectare. For an Irish cow, that was basically 2 cows per hectare. So it was a limit on the number of stock you could have. The country can apply for a derogation to go to 250 kilograms per hectare, and the country has done that, and we've done that successfully for a number of goes, which means at a farmer who is a derogation farmer, and there are about 7,000 of them in Ireland, so 7,000 of the 135 or 7,000 of the 18,000 dairy farmers. So nearly 50% of the dairy farmers are derogation farmers. They have more stringent obligations and more stringent things that they have to do, which a farmer that is less stocked doesn't have to do. One of the big things in the legislation was you had a period of time over the winter. So this, So this red X here, you couldn't apply chemical or organic fertilizers over the winter period. And in Ireland that was defined differently depending on what part of the country you're in, based on the rainfall. The idea being, if you apply nutrients at a time where the crop doesn't need it and when water is moving through the soil, there's a risk of water contamination occurring, and it's more like waste management than nutrient management. So that was banned for us. From the middle of September, you're not allowed to apply fertilizer, and from the middle of October, you're not allowed to apply manure. And that ban holds until about the middle of January to early February each year, which also means the farmers need to have a mandatory amount of storage capacity to store their manures over that winter period. There was areas, all tillage farms have to have green cover. It's arguable whether they ever did or didn't, but a lot of them didn't actually have much greenery. So the idea here again being, so a lot of our tillage systems would be spring cropped. You plant the crop in spring, you harvest it in August, and then from August through to the next spring, there's nothing growing. So you get nitrogen mineralization occurring and huge amounts of nitrogen being lost from the soil. You could lose up to 80 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare over that winter period because there was no crop present. The big one that really hit our farmers was maximum fertilizer rates for nitrogen and phosphorus. The regulations took our best management guide for fertilizers and made them legislative limits, which, we moved from a recommendation to statutory limit, thou shalt not apply more than this, which again, there's a lot of nuances in fertiliser recommendations. It made it very complicated for us as an advisory body. So it did, as I mentioned, minimum storage requirements, and there was also a need to maintain buffer zones, etc., adjacent to watercourses. Over the years, we've become, I suppose, a bit more stringent, and more recently, in the most recent one now, we have prevention of direct runoff from roadways. So the farm roadway running through the farm is a potential source of nutrient and contaminant input, sediment into rivers. So this now has to, from 2021, you have to prevent direct discharges from that. There's new extended setback distances from waterways and watercourses, and the exclusion of animals is now a regulatory requirement for derogation farmers. One thing I forgot to mention is, in terms of the fertiliser component and nutrient balances, we work on a phosphorus, so we don't have a nitrogen sort of surplus value, we have a phosphorus limit on our soils. So we actually operate on a 0p balance. We're not allowed to apply phosphorus unless there's a demonstrable need for the soil to have phosphorus added to it. Most of our farms do not import manures. Most of our farms don't export manures. They use their own manures. So for you to be able to have an additional input of phosphorus fertiliser, there has to be a demonstrated agronomic requirement based on soil test and crop to demonstrate that you actually need that phosphorus. Additionally, now we've also got an organic matter test for our soils. So the top measure here, so some of our soils are quite peaty, so Ireland's pretty wet most of the time, so we have some peaty soils, and those peaty soils don't sequester phosphorus. So we actually have a different fertiliser recommendation for organic soils versus mineral soils. That's now a legislative requirement that if they're in a zone that is deemed to potentially have peat, they have to take a soil test to demonstrate that they're either a mineral soil or an organic soil. And then the appropriate fertiliser recommendations are carried out. We've reduced the area that a soil sample can represent from 8 hectares to 5 hectares. And there's some new sort of phosphorus limits as well. So you can see, as I mentioned, the Nitrates Directive, most of what I'm talking about here is phosphorus, it's not nitrate. Water Framework Directive came along, and this integrated all of these European policies into one policy, which was good water quality, good status for all waters across the entire EU by 2015. So completely, absolutely unmanageable. No country has achieved this or could achieve this, because it's just crazy. So we've been through a couple of stages of river basin management planning. It divides the whole country up into catchments, and each catchment then has to have pollution pressures assessed, etc., etc. So a huge amount of work that has been done. As I mentioned, this is our general water quality. By 2015, I think this was our water quality. By 2015 or 2021 or whenever, we're supposed to be up at 100% good status. That line is very steep, and currently our water quality is going in the wrong direction. Yet there has been considerable investment. This is investment in billions of euros in terms of farm buildings, the Rural Environmental Protection Scheme, or the Urban Wastewater Directive. So that's a directive around wastewater discharges from municipal sources to rivers, etc. In our legislation, there was a requirement for us to monitor the effectiveness of the implementation of our Nitrates Directive. And this ended up being what we call the Agricultural Catchments Programme, which is a programme in my research centre. It's an integrated advisory and research group. They work on commercial farms in 6 different catchments across the country. Those catchments are roughly 10 kilometres squared. There's about 300 farmers in total involved in those. And our scientists and our advisors work closely with them to ensure proper implementation of the regulations and to monitor intensively the effectiveness of that. So they measure phosphorus and nitrogen every 15 minutes in the river. So they've almost real-time nutrient data in the river, and they also look at the biological quality of those waters too. When you sort of squint your eyes at that program and you look at the results coming from it, there's a range of different farming types from arable to grassland. And you can see the red X's are where we don't meet the environmental quality standard for phosphorus. So you can see 3 of the sites don't meet it on average, and 3 sites do. For the nitrate, you'll see they all meet it based on the current standard, which is based on a drinking water standard rather than an estuarine limit. So the mean concentrations of nitrate nitrogen, they're ranging from 1 to 7 milligrams per litre. The environmental quality standard for an estuary, so the last freshwater point before you get to saline water, is 2.6. So a couple of these are in trouble. But we don't currently have the legislation to say that because it's a political issue. And ecologically, so this is based on the biology, we'll see that three of the catchments are failing on biology in springtime, and nearly all of them are failing on the biology in the summertime, yet the chemistry says everything's right. So what's going on here? So this is where it starts to get very, very complicated. Where we're moving with this now is critical source area identification. This is one of the catchments, a grassland catchment. The orange coloured areas, sorry, I can't point to both at the same time. The orange areas are areas that have a higher risk of, I suppose, water movement compared to green areas. So where we're moving is site-specific, field-by-field risk assessment for farmers to help them improve water quality. Huge amount of data. And complexity around the management of those individual fields. Again, as I said, this is a small enough area. You're talking a couple of kilometres wide by maybe 5 or 6 kilometres long. It's a small area. Okay. So we've been working at the farm scale as well, and at plot scale, and all sorts of different scales. But one area we've been collaborating with our colleagues on the production side is looking at farm scale dairy farm on a free draining soil over a limestone aquifer, what we would classify as being a really high risk site. Over the years on that site, we have reduced fertiliser and feed inputs. We've improved the spatial distribution of nitrogen across the farm, and again, this is a permanent grassland farm, when we had to reseed the grassland, we did it using minimum cultivation, direct stitching of grass in to avoid cultivating and releasing nitrogen through mineralisation. I'll walk you through this slide now. Over a 10-year period, we looked at groundwater nitrate concentrations in 10 monitoring wells across the site. And what you can see is over the years, so the solid line here is the nitrate concentration. And you'll see that nitrate concentration decreased from an average of about 16 milligrams per litre. So that's about 50% higher than the drinking water limit of 11.3. Over the years, that has decreased and decreased. There's some slight increases and then decreased over that 10-year period. So we've gone from an average being well above the EU MAC, or the drinking water limit, to a value that is on average below it, which is all good news. And we then started to say, well, what's causing this? And don't worry, so fertiliser inputs decreased over time and surplus has changed, but we put all of this data into a statistical model to try and ask the question, what's going on? We got our squared value from various models that we ran ranged from 0.43 or 43% to 75% of the variation in the data. So 0.75 is 75% of the variation in the data could be predicted by these. Fertiliser, the amount of fertiliser going on, however many grazing days there were, so how many days the farm had grazed, the soil moisture, rainfall and sunshine. So we had 2 agricultural management practices, and we had 3 climatic factors, indicating climate is really important in controlling water quality. It's not just agricultural management practices. And I've just said that. And separating climatic and agronomic variations is very difficult unless you have long-term experiments, which this formed part of a long-term experiment. The impact of the regulations in Ireland, and apologies, this is probably a little bit too small, but what we saw was over the years, this is for phosphorus, the yellow line is the one to focus on, that's phosphorus use on dairy farms. So it decreased from about 10 kilograms per hectare on average, down in the late 2000s to about 4 or 5, and it's currently increasing again. And it's increasing again at the moment due to a sustained KT push to improve phosphorus application to our soils. Why is that? We use soil test phosphorus to indicate, I suppose, P availability to the crop. Index 1 means it's too low for agronomic purposes. Index 4 is too high, and index 2 and 3 are where you want to be. And what you'll see is over the years, we got an increase in index 1s, substantial increase in index 1s. And index 2. So index 1 and index 2, 60% of the soils were at the lower end or suboptimal agronomically. So that's why we had a sustained push on improving phosphorus application. Most of our farms are suboptimal for something. This is soil fertility results from 2 years ago. Only 12% of the soils are optimal in terms of pH, phosphorus or potassium. So that's pretty poor. And the reason for this is really important, is the farmers were confusing the regulatory limits in that legislation with the agronomic requirements that their crop had. When a farmer was asked if they had a nutrient management plan, 60 to 70% of them said, no, I don't. Yet under legislation, they submitted one, but they actually thought that was just the regulation. So this is a mix-up of sort of, I suppose, agronomy and regulation, really important. We developed a new national software package called Nutrient Management Planning Online, and this was to help farmers actually visualize their results differently. What they could see here, so based on their soil test phosphorus results, the system produces a map of their farm, and it indicates areas that have surplus phosphorus and areas that require more phosphorus. This is a map that sits in the cab of their tractor, so when they're applying their fertiliser or their manure, they're doing it in that knowledge. And I'm probably running out of time. I'll point out our EPA have just introduced a much more complex way of looking at risk and risk of water pollution. Again, these slides will be available to you. This is highlighting areas that are really at risk of phosphorus loss to water. They've integrated hydrology, agricultural loadings, soil types, etc., and they've highlighted that there are hotspots, particularly on poorly drained soils, so wet soils. And they've identified that's a much greater need to work with those farmers to improve, I suppose, the agronomic approaches that they're taking. And those farmers are probably they're generally not the intensive farmers. They're the less intensive ones, the ones that are less likely to actually use an agricultural advisor. What that led to is the most recent part of our water quality approach is the government with the dairy industry have funded 30 advisors, so 30 independent agricultural advisors to work in these highlighted areas, which are areas that the EPA have identified are likely to be at high risk of water pollution. The industries and government have funded this, that the farmers will work, or the advisors will work with those farmers to provide them one-on-one advice as to what they can do on their farm to improve water quality. On top of that, there are further 30 environmental and agricultural scientists that are now employed in the local authorities, and they're going around walking the rivers and identifying key areas within those catchments which they need to speak to those farmers and get those farmers to use this free advice service. So look, I suppose when I stand back and look at it, water quality is improving in Ireland, but it's slow, and more is needed to achieve the national and EU targets. The voluntary approaches in the 70s, 80s and 90s didn't work. Regulation did help to improve things, but it wasn't the solution on its own. those 500 agriculturally impacted subcatchments, this is where we think we're really going to make some progress now with one-to-one advice, where, you know, rather than the farmer being vilified, they're worked with in a collaborative way to identify where the problem is and what can be done to solve that problem. But it requires resources, and that's what the industry is now dedicated to that. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to further discussions.